like to welcome everyone back to the Strategic Farming webinar series. Today, we've got part one of a two-part series. Part one happening this week, part two happening next week. But part one is going to be focused on how do we make herbicides work better. In part two happening next week, we'll discuss some adjuvants and get people's experience with that as far as what role they play in sort of helping herbicides work better and get better weed control. But for today, we're focused in on that. What can we do to make herbicides work better as a component of weed management? And I do need to thank Extension as well as the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and Corn Research and Promotion Council for their support today. And I do want to take a second here and introduce our two guests. Close to home here, we've got Tom Hoverstadt. He's a research scientist at the Southern Research and Outreach Center in Waseca. He's been on before and certainly a familiar face for most. And then due to the Zoom, we're allowed to bring in people from further away. And we've got the great opportunity here this morning to bring in Tommy Butts from University of Arkansas. He's a weed scientist and he's got a lot of experience with weed management and the different aspects, and particularly he has a lot of knowledge around what we can do to help make herbicides work better. So welcome, guys.
Good morning.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
With that, we are going to get started here. And I thought there was some news, Tommy, that came down yesterday, a court decision of sorts. And so we just wanted to kind of clear that out and get that out of the way. It revolves dicamba tolerant soybeans and the use of the 3 different dicamba products over the top of dicamba tolerant soybeans.
Yeah, so I guess as a weed scientist, I've gotten used to being the bearer of bad news. So it's just kind of a standard thing for me anymore. But the main thing I wanted to hit on right off the top here was yesterday afternoon, about 3:30, 3:45, a court case in Arizona finally kind of made a ruling, and we've been waiting for it. But they basically vacated the labels for Ingenia, XtendiMax, and Tavium. And this happened a couple years ago with a court case out of California. And so it basically has happened all over again now with a different court case in Arizona. And this is still fluid. It's a moving target. So don't hold us to anything constant right now. But what that means as of right now is I'm pretty sure those 3 products are basically off the table. And so that means we have no dicamba herbicide to spray over the top of Xtend crops for this year. Now that could change in the next few, weeks. There may be more litigation. The EPA may come out and say, if it's already in the system, like if you've already purchased it, whatever, you can use it this year. Who knows? There's a variety of things, but as of yesterday afternoon, last night, they vacated those labels. And so there is no legal use of dicamba over the top of those crops as far as we understand it right now.
All right, thanks, Tommy. And so we're going to not try to get too distracted with that court decision that came out yesterday, but that's kind of where things are at, like Tommy said. And we're going to let him get started with sort of the presentation portion of our program. So again, I'm going to turn it over to you and you can share your screen.
Sounds great. Let me share. All right. All good?
Looks good to me.
Perfect. All right. So I've got a handful of slides today, and I'm going to try and get through some of it fairly quickly just so we can have that discussion, because I always think the discussion is more worthwhile than me just sitting up here talking about random things anyway. But basically, my presentation today is all about trying to make herbicides work better and basically considerations that we need to have as we do every single application when we're going out there and trying to maximize our weed control for different things. So the first thing that I wanted to start off with is a football reference, because I'm a big football guy. So I apologize. This is an Arkansas football reference, but I think it'll still be okay. So this is what we're dealing with, and this is why making herbicide applications, better, why optimizing these things are important. And so this is what happens if we do the wrong nozzle, the wrong droplet size, wrong volumes, poor coverage, we do an improper overlap, we have other application setup errors. Our pests just keep chugging through all of that, heading to the end zone. And that end zone is causing yield loss, reproducing more seed that we're going to deal with from year in and year out. So if we keep doing all of these things, throwing at it wrong, that's what happens to us. Okay. That's the best way I can describe what we're dealing with and why this is important. I also like to mention O'Grady here, Arkansas's tight end. About 2 weeks after this play, Arkansas cut him from the football team. So if that doesn't accurately describe the Hogs football team, I don't know what else does. But moving into some other things, the first section of this presentation that I want to talk about that is super important that I think is often overlooked is nozzle selection. And so I want to hit on nozzles, why they're important, and just a whole gamut of things when it comes to nozzles. So the first thing I wanted to hit on is when we look at any nozzle, there's a lot of information that is really needed to help with any kind of recommendation or understand what's going on. The first of which is the nozzle type. So here, this is an MR nozzle. You know, there's things like the XR or AIXR or TTI from TJet. That's really important because it tells us what kind of droplet size or how the nozzle is designed and how it forms droplets. The next is the 110 in this instance, which is the spray fan angle. So this is a 110-degree angle. And then the last thing tells us our flow rate, which is 0.4. So this means that at 40 PSI, this nozzle gives us 0.4 gallons per minute. Now, I say all of this information is critical because a lot of the times when I get asked nozzle recommendations or we start talking about this, I'll ask what nozzle somebody has, and they'll tell me, I have the red one. It doesn't help me. The red tells me the flow rate, so I know that you're running an 0.4 and you have 0.4 gallons per minute. But that doesn't tell me if you have a fine spray or an ultra coarse spray or if it's an angled nozzle or a dual fan or anything else. It doesn't tell me any of that. So you really need to know all of these pieces of information to understand what's going on. Now, nozzles drastically influence spray coverage. So this is just a quick highlight example of that. If we have an XR flat fan, we're sitting at about a medium spray here on the left. And you can see we got about 20% coverage with 5 gallons per acre. If we go to the TTI nozzle, which is an ultra coarse spray, massive droplet size bowling balls, we have to go jump up to 10 gallons per acre to get that equivalent 20% coverage. So droplet size out of these nozzles is crucial for our coverage standpoint. Now, I'm not saying we should be spraying everything with an XR flat fan because the drift potential is so much greater, but it shows how that droplet size will drastically influence our coverage on things. And if we're trying to run the TTI with everything, we have to bump up our volume to try and get any sort of similar coverage. It's very difficult to get coverage with those large droplets. Now, to help emphasize that, bring it back to weed control, right? It always is important to understand how the weed control or how these things impact weed control. This is from some data actually that I had in Nebraska looking at spray volume. And you can see here with a contact herbicide, 5 GPA versus 20 GPA, it acts like we would all expect, right? Greater spray volume improved our weed control. But I will say, even at 20 GPA, we're not getting 100% control there. And I didn't mention what droplet size these treatments are. Droplet size is drastically important, and size and volume go hand in hand. You can't really talk about one without the other. You got to know both of them to have a true conversation as far as optimizing weed control. Now, this is a contact herbicide. If we go to a systemic herbicide like dicamba, 2,4-D, whatever we're talking about, we see the same results. Higher volume does increase our weed control than a low volume, albeit it's still not 100%. It helps, doesn't solve the situation completely. Now, if we go to droplet size, here's where we can make a much bigger impact on our resulting weed control. So this is Liberty at 5 gallons per acre, something that's off-label that we would never recommend with a contact herbicide. But if you look at this 300 micron treatment, which is about a medium spray, that's pretty darn good weed control right there on pigweeds. So droplet size is vastly, in my book, more important than spray volume. Spray volume helps. I'm not saying it doesn't, but if we can pick the right nozzle and get the right droplet size out, we're going to be in a lot better shape right out of the gates, even if we do other things wrong, like pick a wrong spray volume. Now, if we go to a systemic, say like dicamba or 2,4-D or whatever else, we see less of a droplet size effect. You can see between the 300 microns and the 750 microns here from this to this, which is basically like a medium to an extremely coarse. Very little difference, all of them about the same. So you pick the larger one to help reduce drift because you get the same level of weed control, but you can reduce drift. But what's interesting is if you get too big, so we get up to this 900 micron treatment right here at a low volume, even systemics drop off the map as far as their weed control goes. And actually this year at Nebraska, this treatment was a labeled rate of dicamba. It was statistically similar to our non-treated control, meaning I could have sprayed nothing and done just as well as a labeled rate of dicamba at this droplet size. And our TTI nozzles, they're living up here in this range. They're about 850 microns or so. So we're flirting with disaster with some of these nozzles, especially if we're at low volumes. So we have to, with some of these products where we have to reduce drift and we're relegated to certain nozzles, we have to bump the volume up just to get better coverage. Otherwise, we lose control because of that. So the dynamic between nozzle selection and droplet size and spray volume, they go hand in hand. You got to talk about both of them. Just talking about one without the other is really a disservice to understanding that whole dynamic. Now, also, I get a lot of questions on dual fan nozzles and whether there's a benefit to those, particularly because they're more expensive. So do they pay for themselves kind of thing? This is some data that we had collected just the past couple years. The main thing I want to show, so we have an AI-TTJ dual fan, an AI-XR, which is a single fan, a TTI single fan, a TTI 60 dual fan, and then an XR flat fan. The green bars are spray deposits. So greater bar means we had more spray deposits on a card. And then the number above each one of these bars is the droplet size from that nozzle. So the XR gave us our greatest number of deposits. It's also our finest spray and highest drift potential. What's interesting is if you look at the dual fans here, the AI-TTJ and the TTI 60, our droplet size from our TTI 60 and the droplet size from the TTI 60 was much larger than an AI-XR, but it had the same number of deposits on a card. And our AI-TTJ 60 had a bigger droplet size than an AI-XR, but it ended up with more deposits on the card. So there's some indication here that these dual fans are getting us more droplets on a target, which should result in better weed control. Now, if we look at the weed control aspect, this was barnyard grass. We were looking at barnyard grass weed control down here in Arkansas. It wasn't statistically significant, but if you look at seed production, you can see the exact trend we just saw here in opposite fashion, that the TTI, where we had the lowest deposits, we had the greatest seed production. And then with our dual fans, where we had some more deposits, we had reduced seed production compared to even our AI-XR nozzle. Even though that has a smaller droplet size, the number of deposits helped. So there may be some indication that these dual fans are getting us better deposits and getting us better long-term weed control when we talk about seed production. Now, they may aid in it. This is not an end-all be-all conclusion. I don't want to say that dual fans are always better. It does not necessarily mean that. They don't necessarily always improve coverage. They don't necessarily always improve weed control. Like I mentioned here, it was statistically not different. The trends just matched up, and they're often more expensive. So it's something to consider, but I'm not giving a straight out recommendation that, yes, they're better. Go spend the extra money on these. It may just be something to investigate, you know, on your farm, on your operation, on your spray rig, and see if you like them or not. Compatibility is a big thing, and there's not a lot of ways to know this without just mixing and seeing it firsthand. But there's a lot of products that just don't go together. And we don't have, there's so many millions of combinations. We don't have all of this data, so it's tough to give a recommendation on it. So you just kind of got to watch as you're mixing. But there's a lot of products where you can end up with precipitates, where the herbicide drops out and is no longer in a form that'll, you know, land on a plant and be uptaken, or it clogs, you know, sprayers and screens and everything else. That can be problematic. There's also certain things, especially when we start talking micronutrient additions to herbicide applications, where things can go south. So here you can see we had one herbicide, herbicide A. We had a different herbicide, herbicide B. If we mixed in a boron micronutrient with herbicide B, nothing happened. Didn't matter whether boron was in there or not. It was just fine, same spray characteristics. With this herbicide, without boron, we only had 1.6% fines. This was our VMD, or average droplet size, 464. When we all of a sudden added that micronutrient, some sort of chemical reaction occurred with this herbicide. Our average droplet size decreased. Our percent fines jumped by almost 5 percentage points, meaning this is much more drift prone all of a sudden. And you can see even by the look of it, it drastically changed just by adding in this micronutrient into the mix. Again, no way to predict this across the board. It's just, we have to watch it and keep an eye on it. And if you're talking to an applicator and they say, I did this mix, or I did this combination with this nozzle and it didn't look right, it looked like it was drifting more, I tend to believe them, because this stuff happens all the time and we just don't know it. And you can tell if an application is drifting more or doesn't look right coming out of a spray rig. So again, have those conversations. Communication is really important all along the line here. If you're an applicator, if you're an agronomist, a crop consultant, a farmer, have conversations all across the board with these things, because it's just, there's not enough data out there to know all of this firsthand. You just kind of got to watch it, which is a crazy thing for an extension guy to be telling you, but that's the best we can do. There's also some crazy interactions that happen with nozzle selection and different adjuvant and mixes. So this study, we did a TTI nozzle looking at not TTI, a TT nozzle. So not an air induction one, just a TT, but looking at different mixes through this nozzle. And you can see we have 21 different mixes. Mix 21 was just plain water through this nozzle. And if you look at the TJET catalog, the TJET catalog will tell you water through this nozzle should give you a medium spray. And that's what we ended up with. The problem is if you look at these other 20 mixes in here, we have a whole gamut of things that happen to that spray solution. We have some that got bigger and would reduce drift. We have some that really didn't change at all and are still sitting at a medium spray. We even have a couple that actually reduced the droplet size and would be more driftable, more drift prone. And I'll tell you that these two treatments, they're actually some pretty well-known drift reduction adjuvants, and yet they're creating smaller droplet sizes. And now I will say it's not these adjuvants' fault necessarily. Through other nozzles, these adjuvants work, but through this nozzle, these adjuvants fall apart because they're an emulsion-based adjuvant, and the interaction between this nozzle design and an emulsion-based adjuvant does not work and creates finer sprays. So again, no way to predict this necessarily. We just have to keep an eye on our applications, and if something doesn't look right, more than likely something is wrong and we got to change something up, whether it's changing the nozzle, changing the mix, changing an adjuvant, something else. It's just, we got to change up as we go. Real briefly, I wanted to hit on pulse width modulation, or PWM, because this continues to gain in popularity, and there's things to know to set this up correctly. The first thing I wanted to hit on is I often get asked about skips. Would this pulsing not influence skips in the field, right? Or produce skips? And so a quick one to do a calculation. If our sprayer is traveling at 20 miles an hour, that's 29 feet per second. Each one of these nozzles pulses 10 times per second. That's the standard. Some pulse a little bit more, whether it's 15 times per second, whatever else. I'm using the standard of 10 hertz, 10 pulses per second. That means we can travel at 20 miles an hour about 3 feet between every pulse. And then if we're operating at a 50% duty cycle, because we have blended pulse, which means, as you can see in this video, nozzles next door are on an alternate frequency. So these are never off at the same time if you're at a 50% duty cycle, which means you're really only traveling about 1.5 feet before that nozzle is back on again. It's a real short amount of time, even at 20 miles an hour between those pulses. And so they're never off at the same time. You should have very minimal opportunities for skips if you're set up correctly. Now, if you drop below that 50% duty cycle and you all of a sudden have 2 nozzles off at the same time and you're traveling at a high speed, now's the potential where skips can occur. And that's generally where we see them happen, is incorrect nozzle sizing and our duty cycles are too low. When we jump into some other recommendations for pulsing systems, the number one recommendation you've probably heard is no air induction nozzles. And I know there's some companies that like to promote a couple air induction nozzles and they say they're fine. I'm adamantly against it. You need to have a nozzle that's a non-air induction nozzle to work successfully. So here's some videos of a pulsing system. This nozzle on the left, the ER11004 here, is a non-air induction one. And you can see nice, clean cutoffs and turn-ons. You don't have any extra drooling or droplet formations, anything else. A nice spray pattern is forming. It just looks really good. It's really consistent. If you go in the middle, this is a Greenleaf Technologies TADF, I think, or it's an air, I can't remember which one this was specifically, but it's an air induction one. And you can see how it's just drooling out of this nozzle, these big droplets that are forming, and you're not getting a true spray pattern to form, and it just doesn't look right. And then this one over here on the far right is the AI TTJ60 from TJET. And the spray pattern looks okay, and it's not drooling as much as this one. But if you look close right there, that's the air induction port that's supposed to be sucking in air. And you can see water is just pouring out of that port. So it's not functioning like that nozzle's supposed to. And you actually have backflow of water going through your air port, which is not good. These are precision pieces of equipment. You might as well use a nozzle that is actually precise and useful for the system. So get those air induction nozzles on there. That's really important to maximize these setups. A couple other things to note: the optimal duty cycle range is between 50 and 100%. So you want to make sure that you're not dropping below this 50% duty cycle range, or the amount of time that that nozzle is open, right? So every nozzle's pulsing 10 times per second, but that duty cycle tells you how long it's open. So if it's 50%, that means that nozzle's open 50% of the time and closed 50% of the time, okay? Another recommendation, as long as drift mitigation concerns allow it, higher pressures tend to work better on these systems. I like to be above 40 PSI if I can, because there is a pressure loss across these solenoid valves. So you can see up here, this black bar, we were supposed to be at 40 PSI. If we plugged 04 nozzles on this, we lost about 2 to 3 PSI going through that solenoid valve. If we plugged an 08 nozzle on there, we lost about 8 to 10 PSI just going across that solenoid valve. So if you're operating at 30 PSI and you lose 8 PSI, all of a sudden you're down around 20, 22, you're getting below some nozzle manufacturer recommended pressures, and you can have, either poor pattern formation, poor droplet size formation, other things there, and we can run into some problems too. So pulsing systems can be really good, but there's real specific things to get them set up right to be the most effective. Oh, sorry, nozzle sizing. I need to hit on this because I have a lot of questions on this all the time. If you don't know this equation, please screenshot it, save it. This equation is a lifesaver for getting the right size nozzles on and saving your life a lot of headaches as far as overlap, proper pattern formation, proper PSI used, and even with pulsing, getting it sized correctly. So a quick example calculation. I'm sorry, we're doing math in the morning. I'm not a fan either, but we'll do it real quick. If you use this equation, you want to run at 10 gallons an acre on a 20-inch spacing, and you're traveling 20 miles an hour. It's your max speed. That gives us 0.67 gallons per minute, which means if we plug an 06 nozzle on, we have to operate it at 54 PSI to get that output. That's fine. I'm good with that. If we plug an 08 nozzle on, we have to operate it at 31 PSI to get that output. I'm also okay with that. That's probably fine. If we're operating a pulsing system and we plug a 10 nozzle on, because these are very common anymore that I'm used to anyway, that a 110-10 gets plugged onto our pulsing systems. At 40 PSI as a standard, we're operating at a 70% duty cycle to get that output. Again, we're in the window. Everything looks good and rosy. Not a problem. Where the problem comes in is when we have to slow down at the edge of the field or around our field border, we slow down trying to reduce drift or something else. And so now we're down to 12 miles an hour. If you do the math, that comes out to 0.4 gallons per minute now out of each nozzle that we need to do to get the correct flow rate. If we have an 06 nozzle plugged on there, now all of a sudden we're sitting at 18 PSI. If we have that 08, we got to drop all the way down to 10 PSI. And these nozzles just don't function very well when we get those low of pressures. So that's a problem. If we go to the pulsing one, if we keep it at 40 PSI, because I said that was my low limit, right? I didn't want to drop below that. And we have that 10 plugged on. Now all of a sudden we're operating at a 40% duty cycle, and we've dropped below that 50% mark, and we could have skips and other things. So it's important to size our nozzles, not based on just our max speed, but really the range of speeds that we're traveling. Because if we speed up, slow down, this is going to change those pressures that we have to get to, or change those duty cycles. We have to factor all of that in. This would all change if we were trying to be at 15 GPA versus 10 GPA. So there's a lot of things to consider there. Again, use this equation to your advantage. Find a nozzle size that really gives you flexibility across the board as far as your speeds. And it may end up being that you need a couple different size nozzles, particularly if you're doing a lot at, say, 10 GPA, and then you do a lot of 15 GPA work. You probably almost need 2 sets of nozzles for those different GPAs. So watch out for that as well. Glufosinate or Liberty usage. We get a lot of questions on maximizing this effectiveness. This was a survey, some data we had from a survey a couple years ago. I helped conduct a part of this survey down here in the South in Arkansas. Dr. Rodrigo Worley there in Wisconsin conducted the survey up there in Wisconsin in the northern region. And we asked what people's results were basically with using glufosinate or Liberty. And as you can see for both regions, the number one basic response was good. That's pretty well standard what I've gotten used to on Liberty's front, right? It's not I never hear that it's excellent necessarily a lot of the time. I don't hear that it's bad. It just kind of falls into that average type category. Like, yeah, it's good. It works, right? So this is very standard. Now, the way we can improve this, there's multiple different things, spraying during what I call banking hours, during the day, making sure we add AMS to the tank, most likely, using other things like that. There's a lot of different ways we can improve it. One of the main ways that we can improve it, though, I think, is again through nozzle selection. And we ask the question, what nozzle is being used to spray your Liberty applications? And in both the northern region and the southern region, the overwhelming number one response is, I don't know. And that's not good, because with this one, we already showed before, some of the weed control data. If we pick the right nozzle and we have the right droplet size, we can get significantly much better control out of glufosinate or Liberty than if we're picking the wrong nozzles. So it's really important to know what we're spraying this with. It's also really important to not spray Liberty with the wrong nozzle. So like the TTI here, that is a massive droplet size, was number 3 in the north and number 2 in the south. That's a bad idea. If you look right down here, about 40% didn't know what they were spraying it with in the north, for almost 50% in the south. Both of them had about 19% that were using the wrong nozzle because it was too big of a droplet size. So we're talking over half of our applications are either we don't know what we're using or we're using the wrong nozzle. And that's just not going to be a successful model for getting the best out of glufosinate. So really important there. Even if you're a crop consultant and you're just passing along a recommendation to spray glufosinate, just go have a conversation, open those lines of communication with the applicators and be like, this is why it's important. Can we change these? Is there something we can do? Have some conversations there, because it'll go a long way to maximizing Liberty efficacy as well. So at the end of the day, nozzle selection is really, really important. So it can impact all of these different things that we talked about. Now, outside of nozzle selection, a few other things to hit on. This is my scared straight session. All right, right here. This slide is my scared straight slide. So we deal with Palmer amaranth. It's our number one weed here in Arkansas, and we have widespread herbicide resistance that is just absolutely decimating our ability to control this weed. So here's a map of all of our resistances that we have confirmed in the state for Palmer amaranth. All counties shaded in red we have confirmed PPO resistance. So Flexstar, Ultra Blazer, Valor. Also, if you're not familiar with Arkansas agriculture, every county that's shaded in red is a row crop producing county. Everything that's not shaded in red is mountains and forest. Okay. So basically every county where we have row crops, other than a little bit here in the River Valley, has confirmed PPO resistance. Every star is a confirmed instance of where we have S-metolachlor or acetochlor resistance. So dual magnum and warrant are going out the window for us. The 2 crosses here are confirmed Liberty resistance in the state. We have those in those counties. And then the big scary one, the lightning bolts, we have confirmed auxin resistance in the state in 4 different counties. They are all confirmed 2,4-D resistant. The vast majority of the time, if you have one auxin resistance, you have multiple auxin resistance. They kind of carry each other along. I think roughly speaking, these are about 7 to 10-fold 2,4-D resistant, and somewhere about 2 to 4-fold dicamba resistant. And then we also have another auxin that we use in rice called Loyant. It's a whole nother active ingredient. We've also confirmed that at least one of these populations is resistant to that auxin as well. So again, they kind of carry each other all along. If one goes, they all kind of go, which is a scary premise. And then on top of all of that, these I normally don't even mention anymore because it's so ubiquitous, but basically our pigweed in the state is 100% resistant to glyphosate, ALS inhibitors, the yellow herbicides like Prowl and Treflan, and then our HPPD herbicides have pretty well gone out the window too, Callisto and Laudis and those kinds of things. So my scared straight slide, this is what we're dealing with. We have basically no options left. So using multiple approaches and using residuals, which I'm going to hammer on here, is really key for getting your pigweeds and other weeds under control.
Tommy, before you leave that slide, I got a quick question.
Yeah.
I was interested in the other group 15, so like the pyroxasulfone and dimethenamide. Do you use those, or have you looked at those? That would be like the Zidua or Outlook.
Yes. So that's a great question, Ryan. Thank you for bringing that up. So as of right now, what we've noticed is those still work for us. So in these populations, we've confirmed resistant to S-metolachlor and acetochlor, pyroxasulfone or Zidua, and dimethenamide or Outlook are still effective. And so we've been telling guys start switching. And the other recommendation there is if you can rotate through those group 15s, it should hopefully delay evolution of resistance. So we were really heavy dual users, S-metolachlor for a lot of years. We put a lot of pressure on that. If we can rotate through those, use Zidua 1 year, use dual the next year, use Outlook the next year, or if we're overlapping residuals, mix it up, right? Like Zidua pre, dual, early, post, that will go a long ways in helping delay this resistance as well. Yeah, so great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Next slide. Antagonism is a big deal, and we have to watch what we're mixing. Now, I'm down in rice country, so we deal a lot with rice. This is actually a slide I got from Connor Webster down at LSU, looking at weedy rice control in our Provisia system. Provisia is just Quizalofop. It's Assure packaged in a different label and a different jug. But so we have Quizalofop on weedy rice, highly effective. We should be getting 98% control. But if you mix it with 2,4-D, this purple bar is all of a sudden where our control goes on weedy rice. It's all of a sudden less than 40%. This same thing happens if we're mixing Assure or Clethodim with Enlist, and we're trying to control volunteer corn. And I know Tom will probably show a slide after I'm done talking that emphasizes this very much up there in Minnesota. So it's not a fun conversation to have, but we have to split out our grass herbicides, particularly the group ones, Clethodim, Quizalofop, those kinds of things, from our auxins, 2,4-D dicamba, because the antagonism there kills our grass control. And we actually have some other data that shows it hurts our control on pigweeds too, that this also influences the 2,4-D and dicamba and limits our pigweed control. So mixing those is a bad idea, and we have to split them out into separate applications. Temperature can also be a big deal impacting our applications. Again, this is some rice data, but the same carries through for other herbicides and other crops. You can see here, if we had a temperature of 80-degree highs, we were achieving these levels of control with the blue bars, so 50, 60, whatever percent on barnyard grass and rice. If we jumped up to 90 degrees or above, we've lost 20 to 40, percentage points, even here, 65 down to 20, 45, 50 percentage points in control just because it got too hot. The weed size was the same, the moisture was the same, everything else, but it got too hot and these weren't as effective. So that can influence our weed control at the end of the day. Too cold of temperatures can also impact us. This is Italian ryegrass control if you're trying to spray a burn down or maybe trying to control a cover crop early on when we're still too cold. If we have frost before or after, we have survivors versus no frost, and we can kill it real easy with something like glyphosate. So watching our temperatures can be a big deal for maximizing the control. So those are all things that can impact our weed control that we kind of got to keep an eye on as far as maximizing it. Now, a few recommendations to be successful and really take advantage and optimize each weed control program. That's what my next few slides are on. The number one thing I can tell you, use residuals. Residuals are so important, and they are constantly helping improve our weed control programs. This is some data with and without Simply, and this was actually a glufosinate resistant population, but you can see we had almost a 20 percentage point increase in control just by using a residual versus not. If we're in the Enlist system, there's a lot of different mixes that we can do and a lot of different things. I will say the 3-way mix, I'm not a big fan of, generally speaking, because especially down here, if guys are trying to do the 3-way mix, they're trying to do one post only application and walk away from it. And you can see we have a lot of escapes if we just try and get away with one post application and walk away. Whereas if we do sequential applications here, you can see how much cleaner we are with those sequentials. Now, the other thing I like to emphasize is overlapping or overlaying residuals. Now, if you look at these two plots right here, you'd say from a distance, they look really good. They look similar. I don't see a problem. We could cut out this moccasin or S-metolachlor and save ourselves some money. But if you actually zoom in, you can see here where we don't have that overlap and residual, all of these breaks, and in late season, they're going to pop through that canopy, whether it's little grasses, little pigweeds, little other things that cause us problems. Whereas if we overlap that residual, we're tabletop clean still. So it's really important to have that overlap and residual to help us get full season control. Otherwise, we'll have escapes that maybe don't necessarily affect our yield, but we're just returning seed to the seed bank and battling them in future years, which doesn't help us from a long-term standpoint. Also, real quick on Enlist, the tank mix, Enlist One and Liberty, hides a lot of problems. So I highly recommend always having a mixture there. Enlist and Roundup is also a really good mix. Enlist and Liberty is a really good mix. But relying on Enlist One or Liberty by themselves, you can see we have extra escapes if we're doing something else wrong. So we're using the wrong nozzle in this instance. If we use a wrong nozzle, but we use that tank mix, it hides a lot of our problems and we can still get really good control. So tank mixes are real important too. Real briefly on economics, because I also get hit on this. This is an extend flex, but the main things I want to hit on, because this also carries through on the enlist side too. Our highest return on investment treatments, this 5, 6, 8, and 9 here. So this is return on investment, average dollars per acre when we subtracted out herbicide cost and application cost. All of these had multiple mode of action pre's. So whether that was dual plus a dicamba in the pre, or more likely it was boundary or dual plus metribuzin, so a group 15 and the group 5 of metribuzin, you can see they paid for themselves and gave us a higher return on investment. So a strong multiple mode of action pre pays for itself. If we have a strong multiple mode of action pre like boundary again, those gave us our highest levels of weed control, all over 95%. So we're getting better weed control and we're having a better return on investment. And then also 2 out of our top 3 best return on investments had an overlapping residual. So the overlapping residual is also paying for itself and giving us increased weed control. So the things we preach from a weed control standpoint are also carrying through on the economic side and paying for themselves as well. Now, I'd be remiss as a weed scientist if I didn't at least mention integrated weed management strategies. So here's some things you also have to consider, because relying on a singular herbicide like we did for so long in the glyphosate system just is no longer going to be effective for us. We no longer have that easy button. We have to throw multiple things at these weeds to be successful long term. So things that can increase canopy development are a huge advantage. You know, narrowing up row widths, maybe increasing seeding rates. That's an economics thing too, but possibly there. Earlier planting dates can help, and early season weed control, again, pre-emergence residuals are big. Cover crops can help, again, suppress different weeds, and so they can be another cultural strategy. Tillage can be effective. I don't like to recommend this widespread either, because no-till is a good thing in a lot of areas too. But down here, we're running into a lot of areas or a lot of issues with pigweed where we don't have a lot of other options. And deep tillage can be a benefit from a weed control standpoint of basically restarting a soil seed bank. You turn all that soil over, you bury all those seeds down where they can't germinate and emerge, and you can restart your soil seed bank, roughly speaking. So sometimes that's an option in some real dire situations. Cleaning equipment is a big thing to try and stop the spread. This picture is actually from when I was a Wisconsinite and I was up around Eau Claire actually to collect some herbicide-resistant water hemp seed. There's the field on the left and the field on the right. I normally ask, you know, which field was I there to sample out of? Most people tell me the one on the right because that's where you can see all the water hemp. I was actually there to sample out of the field on the left. And if I had a drone image of this, I wish I had it at the time because it'd be super easy to see. Along that field on the right side, right down here, there's perfect semicircles all down the road of water hemp. And when I talked to the grower over here, what he told me was the previous year he had hired a custom harvest crew and they had turned their combine around on the road for every pass and shot everything out of the back of this field into the neighbor's field and spread that herbicide-resistant water hemp into the neighbor's field. So watching what you're doing and being careful of that is important. When I was there at that field, these two neighbors were not talking to each other. They were not very happy about that. But so that's real important. Harvest weed seed control, it's still a work in progress, but something to watch in the near future for trying to eliminate seed going back into that seed bank and stopping it at the source. And again, I hit on this already, but residuals and multiple MOAs are really important. And then the final advice I've got as far as a recommendation to make sure we optimize these applications and herbicides and everything else is make sure we read the herbicide label. And I like to specify, read it correctly. Upside down and backwards, like my little guy Brooker here, is probably not the right way to read a herbicide label. But read them. They give you a lot of good advice. They're going to give you the best chance at success. So make sure we know those things inside and out as well. Finally, just some takeaways. If you didn't remember anything else from my presentation today, take away this campaign that we started down here, the Sports Weed Control Campaign. It's an acronym that gives you all the main details for having successful weed control. So sports, start clean, pre-emergence herbicides, overlap residuals, required integrated weed management tactics. You got to integrate all of these different things to be successful. Timely and selection of multiple effective site of action herbicides. So if you can remember sports and you can remember each one of those, that gets you, 95% of the way there for successful weed management. And then the final football reference I got to throw out there again, football guy, got to do this. This is actually from Arkansas's football season this year, which let me tell you, it was very difficult to find a positive Arkansas football reference from this year because they were atrocious. So I deserve a medal just for that alone for this. But here's how we can be successful for weed control moving forward. I always like to highlight it's important to adjust strategies and be persistent because we're going to have weeds getting thrown at us all the way. We have to juke, jive, keep pushing forward to be successful there. Now, I'm also going to tell you, we're going to do some things that are absolutely failed tactics that do nothing for us out there. They're just running around looking good in a uniform. Okay. That doesn't mean they're not important. We still need them out there. Okay. We got to have all the guys on the field. And there's also things that we might do that might not control our weeds completely, but they're getting in the way. They're helping suppress weeds. They're doing little things. Those are important too. So all of these things play a role, right? But that's not the end of the story. That gets us the first down. We still have to punch it in the end zone. So to do that, we have to start with our big boys up front. Those residuals that I hammered on are so important up front, giving us a clean pocket to make sure we can do the pass. We have to sell the run fake and do the little things and get that guy blocked so our quarterback doesn't get sacked. And then the last thing is we need to plant early, get early canopy development, make sure our crops have a competitive advantage, because if they can get that inside cut, they can wave goodbye to those weeds long term. So it's the best way I can possibly describe what we got to do in football terms. And hopefully you can remember that and that helps guide you through the year. So with that, if you're ever looking for Arkansas weed science information, or you want to look up the weed scientist down here, you can check out all this information or the website. We also have a texting service, which is really cool. You can get updates on your phone if you're ever interested in just learning what weed control stuff is going on in the South. And we also have a Weeds Are Wild podcast series. We normally do an episode a week during the growing season. You can get some good updates there. Big thank you and acknowledgments to all our funding sources and, the aid and people that I have helping me with this. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is just say thank you, and we can start taking questions. But I did want to mention, I'm actually leaving the University of Arkansas and heading to Purdue University here shortly. So I figured I'd share my new contact info. I'm going to be back in the Midwest and can answer some more Midwest type questions moving forward compared to my Arkansas South nature I've had in the past 5 years. But so with that, again, thank you. And we can hammer on this discussion and answer some questions and things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. I really appreciate it. Say, Tom, I don't know if you want to take the second to share slides. Yeah, I know you had a couple of things, but in the interim, then I want to ask Tommy, before we started, we kind of had some discussion about Palmer amaranth and your perspective on why or why not we might not see as big an issue with it in the northern latitudes.
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. On the Palmer amaranth side of things, I'm not, so I will, first thing I will say is I still would be scared of it. It is an animal and a beast. Like, I'm amazed every day when I go out down here and we're fighting this thing and, you let it go and it can get 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide and produce 1 million seeds. Like, it is an animal. But I will say, at least from initial observations and things, it seems like it does not like the north as much as water hemp. Now, water hemp's a kissing cousin and it's just as bad. I mean, I'm not, water hemp is an animal all of its own too that we need to be, concerned with. But it seems like Palmer just doesn't compete as well in the north, whether it's a little cooler or I really think it's a moisture thing. It's originally a desert plant and it likes dry weather. It doesn't like the wet. And down here in Arkansas, we are like the number 3 state for irrigation because we are so dry during the summers. So Palmer just takes over our dry areas. In some of our areas where we're just a little bit wetter, like in the River Valley, there we actually have a water hemp problem and not so much a Palmer amaranth problem. So to me, it seems like where we have some more moisture, especially like the Midwest, where you generally have more moisture than what we do, it seems like water hemp is the much bigger problem than what Palmer is. Again, not telling you not to be worried about it. I just think water hemp's going to be your much bigger area of concern for at least the foreseeable future.
Well, thanks. And that is one thing I did want to mention, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, it's Palmer amaranth's a noxious eradicate weed. It's on that list. And so they've got some pretty big restrictions when it comes to managing and mandatory management of that plant when it's here. They've had some great successes. I know back in 2016, we had a huge introduction in the state. Over 100 different sites. There was some contaminated seed planted. It was a sort of a CRP type blend. So it basically was planted on all these different acres and 100 different sites. And they followed up with that because of the status of the weed in the state, and have managed to kind of declare it eradicated on those sites, except for 3, which are still being actively managed. One of them's down in Houston County, one of them's over in Jackson County, and one I believe is up in Wadena County. So kind of the corners of our state, but it's been a pretty good success. And I'll put the link up there for Report-A-Pest, because they've been helpful to work with as far as trying to mitigate sources of the weed, as well as, you know, coming up with plans for folks when they do have it established, and what they can do to try to get that weed gone, so to speak. So with that, Tommy, kind of a question that came in ahead of the show today. Looking at water hemp now, so kind of switching gears a little bit. People looking for some advice, particularly in the end rows or headlands of their fields and managing water hemp. It sounds like they're having a greater struggle in that environment. And if you've got any ideas to help them out.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And really, so a lot of my presentation today, I should mention this, was on Palmer, right? Because that's what we deal with in Arkansas a whole lot more. Like I just mentioned a little bit ago, water hemp and Palmer are so close in genetics. I mean, they're cousins, right? Or they may even be a brother and a sister at this point. A lot of what I said carries through to water hemp control too. They're that similar. The main things there on on the headlands too is still playing the game with residuals as much as possible. Now it does get a little bit more challenging sometimes on those areas to get the right activating moisture. It's just a little bit different because it's normally a little shallower, a little more compaction, stuff like that. But residuals are still going to be real important. And then the main things, again, I could just emphasize is putting everything in the right situation. Generally, our weeds in the headlands are a little bit more stressed. And so if we can, have the right temperatures, the right environmental conditions, if we can catch just where we have a little bit more moisture, if we can use the tank mixes on some of those things versus just a singular herbicide, if we're picking the right nozzles and we're not putting those in the stressful situations, it's going to be doing all of those little things right that will put us over the edge on some of those more stressed plants, right? That we can overcome it. There's no good silver bullet answer, but that's just kind of where it is.
Excellent. So question here. Do you have any thoughts on the best placement of Liberty herbicide? So if we're looking at timings, if we're going to use, let's say, an enlist system, from your perspective, what's worked best?
Oh, that's a great question. It's tough to give a broad spectrum recommendation, I'd say, because I think it's really dependent on what you set it up with initially as far as a pre-emergence and what row spacing you might be on with, if you're on drilled beans or 15s versus say 30s, something like that. So there's a lot of variables there. Generally, what I would say, the easiest way to put this is the earlier, the better, simply because weeds are smaller. There's probably less soybean canopy that can intercept, and we're not getting coverage on our actual target weeds. Hopefully we can mix in an overlapping residual, and then that'll stop other flushes from happening. Those are the main things that I would say. So generally speaking, kind of the earlier there, like an early post, the better off we'll likely be.
Yeah, and I think Devlin and his grad student Navjot had some work where they kind of showed the exact same thing you just said, that these earlier applications of Liberty worked well, and they had greater consistency when they started with a pre versus not starting with a pre, and then you throw in that overlapping residual and you're even doing better. So
yeah,
so certainly I think that's a good thing. We've talked a lot about coverage and droplet size, gallonage. What are some of the other things when we talk about Liberty herbicide or glufosinate that you think about, and things that we should be concerned with to get that product to work the best it can work?
Yeah. So one of the main things I would say there with Liberty to make it more effective is the time of day factor. That's a big deal that's been shown time and time again to affect it. Normally what we always recommend is banking hours. So, like 8 to 5, 9 to 5, 9 to 6, somewhere in there is where you're going to get your best control out of it. If you spray earlier or later than that or at night, the control drops off pretty significantly. So you want to kind of put it in that. And honestly, the even better window, at least normally, is kind of in that early afternoon where you have a little bit more temperatures, you still have some humidity. That's normally kind of the ideal spot for it if you can do that. If and obviously that's unfeasible to get across all our acres to do everything in that window, but if you can at least do it during the banking hours, that helps out a lot. Uh, AMS helps a ton. And I think, you said like Joe Ikley and maybe Tom Peters or somebody else going to be on next week to talk more about adjuvants. That is a big one to help improve liberty control. We normally don't use AMS in the Mid-South, and I've started talking guys into it to help with liberty efficacy because it even helps us down here more. So those would be kind of two of the main ones I'd consider, getting AMS in there, doing the banking hours, catching the right temperature and humidity if you can, kind of thing in that early afternoon is ideal.
Excellent. So, we've got some specialty soybean markets up here, with buyers that are buying non-GMO soybeans. Do you have any experience with that down in your neck of the woods? And what are people using?
So yeah, great question. Again, we have a big market. I say big, I mean, it's like 5% of our total acres, but 5% of 3.5 million acres is still pretty good size. We have a huge poultry market down here. And so we have a lot of different conventionals and things that go to our poultry market. And man, it gets real challenging for our guys down here because you just don't have a whole lot of post options, and we have so much PPO resistance. Normally the number one recommendation to get after the pigweeds in a system like that is Flexstar, Cobra. Cobra doesn't work great for us down here. It works better in the Midwest than it does for us, but stuff like that, and those are just not super effective for us anymore because of the resistance side of things. So really what we're relying on a lot is just residuals and overlapping them as tight as possible. And we may end up with 3 or 4 applications of residuals trying to hold stuff back. And then, in grass control, we have a lot of grass issues. Select becomes really important for us, clethodim. We use a lot of the different ALS chemistries for some of the other random broadleaf stuff that pops up, like sickle pod and teaweed, and common cucklebur is making a comeback and stuff like that. And so we're trying to rely on like the first rates and the classics of the world and the pythons of the world, all that kind of stuff. So it is the conventional beans and things like that becomes a real cocktail of mixing like a lot of the old chemistries. It's really going, back to the basics on some of that weed control stuff. And for the most parts, if guys are timely, we can do a good job. If we get behind it all, that really kills us in the conventional side.
Okay, so kind of switching back a little bit, we got a question that came in. I didn't see this one until this now. So back to the enlist type system. Can you run through tips, tricks to getting that enlist Liberty tank mix thing to work out? And anything that is like kind of a red flag, keep it out of there when I'm trying to get an enlist Liberty tank mix to work.
Yeah, so for the most part, I generally don't see a whole lot of issues with that mix. If we're talking enlist and Liberty, really there's not a whole lot we need to do to get the most out of that. An AMS in there would still likely help, making sure that we're getting the most out of the Liberty front. But that mix by itself is normally pretty good. As far as other tank mix partners trying to throw in there, it depends on weed species and things like that. I haven't messed around with just about everything, but most overlapping residuals, so the duals, the Ziduas, all of that, you're good to go. I don't normally see any problems there. If you're running some of the ALS chemistries, I normally don't see a bad problem there mixing in there. Again, the first rates or the classics or stuff like that should all be pretty good. I still would not recommend mixing in like a clethodim or a quizalofop there, because even though you're getting some grass activity from Liberty and 2,4-D, it's still just going to shoot you're not getting grass activity out of 2,4-D, but you're getting some grass activity out of the Liberty that may help, like the quizalofop or the Select being in there. You're still just shooting yourself in the foot on, dropping from 98% to 40% with that Select or quizalofop. And then you're just asking for resistance to evolve because you're basically giving it like low, ineffective doses. And so I would keep those out all the time. I would never mix a 2,4-D and those grassers, period. Even if you've got other things like Liberty that may help in the tank, they just need to stay out. So that would kind of be the main things there, I would say.
Hey, question here about another kind of technology question, I guess, about See and Spray. You know, a lot of farm media is covering this See and Spray technology, and little question if you've had any chance to see anybody that's done work yourself with the See and Spray technology. And the question really comes back to some of the residual herbicides, and I think I understand what they're getting at with this question. This whole concept of, are we going to see labels change in how we're using these residuals with the See and Spray technology? Because, you know, our labels say a rate per acre, and we're spraying less than a full acre with every, you know, spray or whatever. So just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, so we have some experience. We have a research unit down here in Arkansas that I've been able to kind of see and be a part of through a couple students and things like that. As far as See and Spraying residual parts, we're really never going to recommend that. Now it's, you know, there is some potential, and I know what I've seen some questions on that, especially, you know, say you've got a field where, you know, you have some serious field history on where you have a bad patch in this one spot all the time and a bad patch over here. Could I just heavy layer my residuals in those areas and save on the rest of the field? Maybe in some real specific incidences could we get away with that. I will say, from a weed science perspective, the vast majority of the time, we are never going to recommend the See and Spray for that aspect from a residual standpoint. The See and Spray Ultimate, that's kind of the main one available right now. I like the standpoint that it's a dual tank, dual boom system. And one of those booms is basically an always on broadcast. And that's where I would always be putting my residuals. The residuals I would be broadcasting to cover my basis, you know, across the board. And then I would play the games with my post-emergence products to try and do that See and Spray. The results there too are variable. In some cases, we see some really good savings. Some of our situations down here, we just have such high weed pressures in certain fields. We end up just, it doesn't save us because we end up broadcasting because we have such widespread weed densities. So it really boils down to a lot of the specific areas, what the field history is, what your weed problems are, all that kind of stuff. But from the residual standpoint, I would very rarely ever think that it was a good idea to try and See and Spray the residual part. I would want that broadcasted all the time.
Okay, excellent. So we got your perspective on putting grass killers in with our 2,4-D, and from your perspective, you're separating those two things out. Now, Tom, you're on, and I'll give you a chance to share your screen because we did a little bit of work with this in Minnesota, looking at antagonism. And when we have these tank mixes, and certainly have seen the same thing. But Tom, maybe if you wanted to show some photos and then give a couple comments on, you know, did rate play a role in this? And we did look at a couple of products, but just to kind of, you know, not try to make things more fuzzy, but maybe give some other perspective too.
Sure, I'll give a little perspective on a few things that I heard today, and I've got a slide here. We're talking about making things work the best they can. This happens to be a trial that we did with Ryan. He recognized right away that growth regulators were antagonizing volunteer corn control. And over the years, we've had a lot of people plan a weed control system for soybeans, and then the last thing they say is, I'm going to throw in a corn killer. And that's been fairly successful, not always, but it's not been as bad as it has now when we have the growth regulators for use in soybeans. And the top left here is, you don't need numbers to show you that this was an absolute disaster. Both these plots had exactly the same products applied, and the top one, Assure, did not control volunteer corn at all. And the bottom one, it's what you'd expect. And I think Tommy put up a similar thing with rice. He shaded what you'd expect, 98% control, and what he got was more like 40. We saw the same thing with soybeans here in Minnesota. So just splitting out the mixture of Assure, not applying it as a tank mixture, you can save a lot of money. And most people that I tell that do their own spraying, I think that's certainly a good way to maximize the use of those products. A couple of things that Tommy also mentioned. He had a thing about Liberty and all these good, finicky, number of things. Seems like there's a lot more interest in, and Liberty is becoming more available. One thing I would put on those, I didn't see in that comment, I would say Liberty is less foolproof than what we're used to with glyphosate. Glyphosate was pretty foolproof. Liberty or glufosinate, they even sound a little bit alike, but they're not interchangeable. There's a lot of things you need to do to make Liberty work as well as it can. Tommy talked about ammonium sulfate. If you have trouble remembering that, I like to tell people the way Liberty works is it causes free ammonia in the plants, and it looks a lot like if you've ever seen anhydrous ammonia when it leaks out and kills weeds or crops. It glufosinate's activity looks like that. So ammonia is important with glufosinate. The other thing that's less foolproof is weed size. It's a lot easier to mistake getting weeds too big with glufosinate. So earlier is usually better. One other thing I heard Tommy talk about was he had a question about how to deal with those headlands and water hemp. And one thing, what's the problem with headlands? Often crop canopy isn't as good in the headlands as it is in the rest of the field. And when water hemp has a chance in July, it has a little light in there, it's going to come. Then all of a sudden, in the middle of August, you've got a problem. So anything you can do to promote crop canopy on those headlands. And I even jotted down, what about getting the cultivator out for the headlands? Maybe that might help. So those are a few things. I also had some information. Now we've talked about, and Tommy talked about residuals, and that's where it's at for water hemp control. We're used to that. Brian's done a lot of work over the years, and here he's looking at about 20% control improvement with the layered pre's or added residual. We did some work in Waseca, and it's the similar concept, but my soils in Waseca here are high organic matter, high clay content, fine textured. And Tommy looked at it also. He said, read the label. Now, a lot of these, the label doesn't allow you to use much. I had the best success with, in this case, Warrant, where we could use the full labeled rate twice. So if you look at the dual label, there's a maximum use per year. Pay attention to that. I also had some better success when we switched products. Here I had Valor down on the far right there, just Valor, and then adding some Post. I think Tommy mentioned that. Mix it up a little bit. And one thing I'd like to leave the group with is I was at the pest management short course and listened to Tom Peters this year, and he had this slide up there. I borrowed it from him. Shows number of products we've used over the years. Between 96 and 2006, we went way down. I think that's come back up because we've learned that we can't do the same thing and expect the same results for year after year. And he's got an Australian weed science. He quoted, said, if it works, do something different next year. I kind of like to take that old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That does not work with weed control. I would turn that around and say, if it ain't broke, it's going to break. So
Thanks, Tom.
Tommy even mentioned, even in the group 15s, don't stick with the same one. Switch from Dual to Warrant to Zidua. Maybe that would be helpful. So if it ain't broke, it's breaking.
All right, thanks, Tom. And I see as moderator, I've failed a little bit here as we've run out of time. So I do, we have to make a break there. I want to thank our speakers. It was excellent today to have you guys on, get your perspective on things. I think it was very productive, and thank you, everyone that's tuned in today. As you leave today, there will be a short 3-question survey. We'd really appreciate it if you fill that out and give us some feedback. Once again, want to thank our sponsors, Minnesota Corn, Minnesota Soybean, helping out today. And again,